The office of Detective Mark Gallo smelled of stale coffee and regret, a scent that had seeped into the very wood of his desk over 12 long years. Outside, the October sky wept a cold, steady drizzle against the windowpane, mirroring the dreary ritual unfolding within. On his desk lay the Sarah Jenkins file, its manila folder softened and frayed at the edges from countless openings. Mark, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and unresolved guilt, traced the faded ink of her name. He was a rookie then, young and eager, her partner. Now he was a weary detective, haunted by the ghost of his first major case, a case that was never a case, just a void. This annual pilgrimage through the sparse collection of dead-end leads and witness statements was a form of self-flagellation, a promise he silently renewed each year to the woman who had vanished into the rain-swept darkness. 20 miles away, Chloe Jenkins stood in the quiet of her small apartment, a place deliberately chosen for its lack of memories. At 22, she wore her mother's absence like a second skin, an invisible weight that had shaped the woman she had become. She ran a thumb over a framed photograph on her windowsill, a 10-year-old girl with a gapped-tooth smile, held tightly in the arms of a woman in a crisp police uniform. It was the last picture ever taken of them together. Chloe had spent more of her life without her mother than with her, a reality that had forged a resilient, solitary strength within her. Yet, beneath that stoic surface, the unanswered questions of that night still echoed, a constant, low hum of uncertainty that prevented any real sense of peace or closure from ever taking root. The memory of 1999 was a film reel of warm, saturated colors, a stark contrast to the desaturated present. Officer Sarah Jenkins moved with a confident grace, her uniform a symbol of protection, not a premonition of tragedy. In the small, sunlit kitchen of their modest home, the scent of breakfast lingered as she knelt to tie the shoes of a chattering 10-year-old Chloe. Sarah was more than a cop. She was the town's steadfast compass, the single mother who balanced late-night shifts with school plays and bedtime stories. Her smile was a source of comfort, her presence a promise of safety. On that final evening, she hugged Chloe tight, the familiar scent of her mother's clean, simple perfume, a memory that would have to last a lifetime, promising to be home before she woke up. Pine Ridge itself was a character in this unfolding drama, a town nestled between the deep, whispering woods and the cold, silent expanse of the lake. In 1999, it was the kind of place where front doors were left unlocked and everyone knew your family history. The main street bustled with a gentle, predictable rhythm, from the morning rush at the diner to the evening chatter outside the single-screen movie theater. But beneath this idyllic veneer, the town held its breath. The murky, bottomless lake served as a perfect metaphor for Pine Ridge's own hidden depths, a dark repository for secrets that the community tacitly agreed to ignore. It was a place of deceptive tranquility, where the placid surface concealed the unseen currents of resentment, fear, and buried transgressions. Sarah's daily routine was an intimate dance with the town's pulse. Her patrol car was a familiar sight, cruising down the quiet residential streets and winding along the remote, tree-lined road that hugged the lake's perimeter. She knew who was feuding with whom, which teenager was prone to mischief, and which lonely elder just needed someone to talk to for a few minutes. She was an integral part of the town's fabric, a weaver of its social tapestry. Her work was not just about enforcing the law, it was about maintaining the delicate balance of a community that believed itself immune to the darkness that lurked in the wider world. This profound connection made her sudden, traceless disappearance all the more incomprehensible, a violent tear in the very reality the town had constructed for itself. As autumn deepened that year, a persistent, chilling rain began to fall, slicking the roads and casting a somber gray pall over Pine Ridge. The storm clouds gathered over the lake, their dark reflections turning the water's surface into an inky, unreadable mirror. The familiar tranquility of the town began to feel different, heavier, charged with a sense of foreboding. The steady drumming of the rain was a countdown, each drop a tick of the clock toward the moment the town's carefully maintained peace would be shattered. On that night, as Officer Sarah Jenkins responded to a routine call on a remote road near the water's edge, the storm wasn't just in the sky. It was waiting for her in the suffocating darkness of Pine Ridge. The rain on the windshield of Patrol Car 7 was a frantic, percussive rhythm, a stark contrast to the steady, calm Officer Sarah Jenkins projected. The wipers fought a losing battle, smearing the water across the glass in hypnotic, sweeping arcs that did little to pierce the suffocating darkness of Lakeside Road. The dense pines crowded the narrow asphalt, their branches dripping and swaying like grieving figures in the wind. Inside the car, the air was warm, smelling faintly of coffee and the clean, sterile scent of the vehicle's interior. Sarah felt the familiar solitude of the late-night shift. A quiet cocoon where the town's sleeping pulse was hers alone to monitor. It was a peace she cherished, a moment of stillness before the inevitable crackle of the radio. That crackle came just after midnight, a burst of static followed by the dispatcher's clipped professional voice. The call was deceptively mundane, a report of a suspicious vehicle, lights off, parked near the old derelict lumber mill turnout. It was a common enough complaint, usually just teenagers looking for a secluded spot. Unit 7, can you do a wellness check? Sarah keyed the mic, her voice unwavering and clear. 10-4, dispatch, en route to the mill turnout now. She steered the heavy Crown Victoria onto the slick, winding road, the powerful engine a low hum against the storm's fury. The lake was a vast, invisible entity to her right, its cold, dark presence more felt than seen. As she drove, the headlights carved a solitary, shifting tunnel through the ink-black, rain-lashed world. The skeletal branches of the trees seemed to claw at the edges of the light, creating fleeting, monstrous shadows that danced and writhed on the periphery. The familiar road felt alien in the storm, each curve a new, unseen challenge. She passed the last glowing porch light of the residential area, plunging deeper into the isolated wilderness that bordered the town. This was the part of Pine Ridge that held its breath, where the thin veneer of community safety wore thinnest, and the deep woods and deeper water kept their own counsel. The sense of isolation was absolute, a feeling that both sharpened her focus and pricked at her senses. Miles away, in her small, warm bed, 10-year-old Chloe stirred. The wind howled against her window pane, a mournful sound that seeped into her dreams. She was vaguely aware of her mother's absence, a familiar emptiness on stormy nights like this. She clutched the worn, plush fabric of her teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, pulling him tighter against her chest, as if his silent companionship could form a shield of protection around her mom. She pictured the patrol car, a sturdy blue and white vessel navigating the dark with her mother at the helm, a steadfast beacon of safety. She whispered a small, sleepy prayer into the bear's ear, a child's simple plea for a safe return before the morning light broke through the clouds. Sarah arrived at the turnout, a gravel-strewn crescent carved out of the hillside overlooking the lake. She killed her headlights, allowing her eyes to adjust to the gloom, her training kicking in. The spot was empty. There was no suspicious vehicle, no teenagers, no sign of anyone at all. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of rain on the car's roof and the angry roar of the wind whipping across the water's surface. A flicker of unease, cold and sharp, cut through her professional composure. The call felt wrong, a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. She scanned the tree line, her gaze sweeping over the skeletal frame of the abandoned mill, a dark silhouette against a darker sky. Back at the brightly lit station, Rookie Officer Mark Gallo nursed a lukewarm cup of coffee, the bitter taste of familiar companion on the graveyard shift. He heard Sarah's voice over the radio as she reported her arrival at the location, her tone as steady and unflappable as ever. He felt a pang of admiration. She handled the solitude of the job with a grace he was still trying to find. To him, this was just another routine call on a miserable, forgettable night, a minor disturbance that would soon be resolved. He turned his attention back to the mountain of paperwork on his desk, the quiet hum of the station, a comforting buffer against the raging storm outside. Sarah keyed her mic one last time, the plastic cool against her palm. "Dispatch, Unit 7. I'm Code 4 at the mill turnout. Nothing to report. It's clear." Her voice was calm, projecting the all clear, but as she spoke, a sound to her left, near the water's edge, made her pause. A sharp snap, like a heavy branch breaking underfoot. Her head whipped around. "Wait," she said, her voice dropping, the professional cadence replaced by a sudden sharp edge of alarm. "Dispatch, there's—" Before she could finish, the transmission was severed by a deafening roar of static, a violent electronic scream that clawed through the speakers at the station before falling into an abrupt, chilling silence. The dispatcher, a veteran named Mary, didn't hesitate. "Unit 7, repeat your last transmission. Officer Jenkins, do you copy?" Her voice was tight, stripped of its earlier calm, now laced with a steely urgency. The response was nothing, just the empty, humming carrier wave of a dead channel. The silence that filled the comms room was profound, a vacuum that felt heavier and more menacing than any sound. Every officer within earshot knew what that kind of sudden quiet could mean. A routine night had just shattered, the pieces falling away into an abyss of uncertainty. The storm outside seemed to mock them, its fury a physical manifestation of the chaos that had just been unleashed. Mark shot up from his desk, the half-finished report forgotten. The jarring transition from Sarah's alarmed voice to the violent static had sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. It wasn't equipment failure. It was an interruption, forceful and deliberate. His heart hammered against his ribs. He saw the same recognition in the eyes of the other officers in the room. Mary was on the radio again, her voice a controlled command. "All available units, proceed to Lakeside Road, mill turnout. Possible 10:33 with Unit 7. No contact with Officer Jenkins." The station erupted into a controlled flurry of motion, but beneath the professionalism, a palpable fear had begun to take hold. Within minutes, the darkness of Lakeside Road was sliced apart by the strobing red and blue lights of responding patrol cars. But the storm was a relentless, impartial foe, turning the search into a nightmare. The wind tore at their jackets, and the torrential rain obscured their vision, turning the ground into a treacherous sea of mud. They swept the turnout with high-powered flashlights, their beams cutting futilely through the downpour. There was nothing. No patrol car, no sign of a struggle, no tire tracks leading off the road into the woods or toward the lake. It was as if Officer Sarah Jenkins and her entire vehicle had been plucked from the earth, erased by the storm. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively bright. But for Chloe, the world had gone dark. She awoke not to the smell of her mother making breakfast, but to the sight of two grim-faced police officers standing in her living room. One was the chief, his face etched with a sorrow he couldn't hide. The other was the young rookie, Mark Gallo, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a haunted, lost expression. The silence in the house was a physical weight, pressing down on her. No one had to say the words. Her mother's absence was a deafening scream that filled every corner of their home, a void that had opened in the night and swallowed her whole. Mark stood on the muddy bank, staring out at the placid gray surface of the lake. The water, so calm now, offered no clues. It was a vast, unreadable face, hiding its secrets in its murky depths. The search teams were still working, their movements methodical and grim, but he knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that they wouldn't find her here. The emptiness he felt was profound, a hollow ache of guilt and helplessness. She had been his partner, his mentor, the one who had shown him how to be a good cop. And on his watch, on a stormy night, on a lonely road, she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a final static-choked word, and a silence that would haunt him for years to come. The first year bled into the second, and the frantic energy of the initial search dissipated like morning fog over the lake, leaving behind a cold, heavy stillness. For Mark Gallo, the passage of time wasn't a healer, but a corrosive agent, slowly eating away at the hope he hadn't even realized he was clinging to. He was no longer the wide-eyed rookie. The case had chiseled the youth from his face, replacing it with a hardened, somber mask. The town of Pine Ridge, in a collective act of self-preservation, began to speak of Sarah Jenkins in the past tense. Her disappearance became a scar on the community's psyche, one that ached on rainy nights, but was otherwise covered up and ignored, a tacit agreement to move on from a mystery that offered no solace. For Chloe, now 11 and living with an aunt in the next town over, her mother's absence was a constant, tangible presence. Her childhood home was sold, its familiar rooms and scents replaced by the sterile strangeness of a new life she hadn't chosen. At school, she endured the clumsy, whispered condolences and the probing questions of other children, each one a small paper cut on her already wounded heart. She learned to build a fortress of silence around herself, a stoic exterior that belied the chaotic storm of grief, confusion, and a profound aching loneliness that raged within. Her mother's smile, once a source of infinite comfort, was now a ghostly image that she fought desperately to keep from fading completely. By the 5th anniversary, the case of Officer Sarah Jenkins was officially declared cold, a bureaucratic term that felt like a final, brutal betrayal to Mark. Now a detective, he kept her file not in the cold case archives, but in the bottom drawer of his own desk, a personal cross to bear. The weight of it informed every new case he took on, especially those involving missing persons. He saw Sarah's ghost in the frightened eyes of every family member, a constant spectral reminder of his first and most profound failure. His dedication was misinterpreted by his colleagues as obsession, a dark fixation that isolated him within the very department he had once been so eager to join. At 15, Chloe had mastered the art of deflection. She was a teenager navigating the treacherous waters of high school, burdened by a story everyone in the region knew. She actively avoided the town of Pine Ridge, especially the winding road that led to the lake, a place that felt like the edge of the world to her. This avoidance was a survival tactic, a way to carve out an identity separate from the girl whose cop mom vanished. Yet in the privacy of her room, she would secretly study the scant collection of old newspaper clippings about the case, her fingers tracing the grainy photo of her mother, trying to bridge the chasm between the heroic officer in the headlines and the warm, laughing woman who once sang her to sleep. The town of Pine Ridge had woven Sarah's disappearance into its local mythology. Her story became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered among teenagers who dared each other to visit the derelict lumber mill on moonless nights. The tragedy had acquired a patina of legend, softening the sharp edges of the real human loss. For the older residents, her name was a synonym. For the moment, their illusion of small-town safety was shattered forever. The community had healed over the wound, but the scar tissue was thick and uneven, a permanent reminder that darkness could take root even in the most familiar soil, and that some questions were destined to be swallowed by the deep, silent water of the lake. Mark often found himself lost in memories, replaying his last conversations with Sarah. He remembered her mentoring him after a particularly rough domestic call, her voice calm and steady. "The job isn't about being tough, Mark," she had said, her gaze firm. "It's about being the person who walks into the chaos and brings a little bit of order back." The memory was a double-edged sword, a source of inspiration that was also steeped in the bitter poison of guilt. He endlessly questioned his own actions that night. Why hadn't he pressed the dispatcher for more details? Why hadn't he just driven out there himself? The what-ifs were a relentless chorus, a soundtrack of regret that played on a loop in his mind. Chloe's 18th birthday was a quiet, hollow affair, a milestone starkly marked by the person who wasn't there to celebrate it. That afternoon, in a sudden act of defiance against her own fear, she drove to Pine Ridge and walked to the edge of the lake. She stood there for a long time, watching the placid gray water, a vast, indifferent expanse that held the answer to her life's greatest question. The grief she had suppressed for so long resurfaced, but it was now mingled with a sharp, burning anger. It was an anger directed at the faceless unknown that had stolen her mother, at the town that had forgotten, and even, irrationally, at her mother for leaving her so utterly alone. The 10th anniversary arrived with little fanfare, marked only by a brief mention in the Pine Ridge Ledger. Mark continued his somber tradition of visiting Chloe, who was now in her first year of college. Their annual meetings were awkward rituals, burdened by a shared history that was too painful to articulate. He would give her a small, thoughtful gift, a book, a gift card for a coffee shop, and she would politely accept, her eyes holding a familiar, guarded sorrow. They were two survivors tethered to the same tragedy, orbiting the gaping void of Sarah's absence, close enough to feel its pull, but never able to truly bridge the distance between their separate pains and find comfort in each other. As the years mounted, Mark's investigation became a solitary, almost spiritual quest. He spent his weekends and vacations revisiting the cold trail, poring over old witness statements for any nuance he might have missed, any contradiction that could pry open a new line of inquiry. He drove the length of Lakeside Road hundreds of times, in every season and at every hour, hoping the landscape itself might offer up a forgotten secret. His colleagues watched with a mixture of pity and respect, viewing him as a man haunted by a ghost he refused to exorcise. His personal life had crumbled under the weight of his obsession. His marriage had ended, and friendships had withered from neglect, leaving him with nothing but the case. Chloe, pursuing a degree in journalism, found an outlet for her unresolved feelings in the written word. It was a subconscious choice, a desire to uncover truths and give voice to the silenced. For a class project, she wrote a powerful, long-form piece on the psychological toll that cold cases take on the families left behind, using her own experience as the anonymous, emotional core of the narrative. It was her way of shouting into the abyss, of transforming her passive, helpless grief into an active search for understanding. She was meticulously dissecting the anatomy of loss itself, hoping that by understanding the universal pain, she could somehow make sense of her own specific, unending sorrow. In moments of quiet vulnerability, a specific memory would often surface for Chloe. She was 7, terrified of a thunderstorm, and her mother had wrapped her in a blanket on the porch to watch the lightning. "Don't be afraid of the noise, sweetie," Sarah had whispered, her arm a shield of warmth and security. "It's just the sky rearranging its furniture. It's powerful, but it always passes." That memory, once a source of immense comfort, now carried a tragic irony. The storm that took her mother had never passed for Chloe. It was a permanent weather system that had settled over her life, and she had been forced to learn how to navigate its relentless thunder and lightning all on her own. By the dawn of the 12th year, Sarah's file was a permanent fixture on the corner of Mark's desk, its manila folder worn soft as felt from his constant touch. He no longer expected a sudden breakthrough, a deathbed confession, or a forgotten clue to miraculously appear. The initial fire of his hope had long ago burned down to grim, stubborn embers of duty. His quest was no longer about finding Sarah alive or even about the abstract concept of justice. It had become something more elemental, a need for a conclusion. He simply needed to write the final sentence to the story that had become his life's work, even if that sentence was the one he had always dreaded. After graduating, Chloe moved back, not to Pine Ridge, but to a neighboring town, unable to sever the final tie to the place where her life had fractured. She took a quiet job as an archivist at a local library, finding a strange comfort in the orderly silence and the preservation of other people's stories. It was a life built on a fragile truce with uncertainty. She had convinced herself that she had accepted the not knowing, that she had packed her grief away into a neat, manageable box. But every time she saw a police car or a woman with her mother's shade of hair, the lid of that box would creak open, reminding her that her peace was a carefully constructed illusion. The 12th summer was unusually hot and dry. A relentless sun beat down on Pine Ridge, and a severe drought took hold of the region. As Mark Gallo sat in his office staring at another rainy day photograph of Sarah's empty turnout, he was unaware of the slow, silent change occurring just miles away. Chloe sorted through historical documents at the library, her own history locked away, and at the lake the water line receded day by day, pulling back like a curtain. The vast, murky body of water, which had held its secrets with an iron grip for over a decade, was slowly, reluctantly, preparing to reveal the one it had guarded most jealously of all. The summer of 2011 was a season of relentless, oppressive heat that baked the earth of Pine Ridge until it cracked. A historic drought had taken hold, and its most dramatic effect was on the lake. The water line had receded by dozens of feet, exposing a wide, barren strip of shoreline that had not seen the sun in decades. The familiar placid body of water now had a sunken, skeletal look, its edges a graveyard of old bottles, rusted engine parts, and forgotten debris. It was on one of these brutally hot afternoons, under a bleached white sky, that Earl Miller, an elderly fisherman whose family had lived in Pine Ridge for generations, decided to explore the newly revealed mudflats, hoping to find a new, deeper spot to cast his line. Earl moved with the slow, deliberate shuffle of a man who knew the land and the water intimately. He navigated the cracked, dry mud, his boots making soft, sucking sounds with each step. His eyes, accustomed to scanning the water's surface for the faintest ripple, were instead drawn to an unnatural shape far out on the exposed lakebed. It was a glint of metal, a patch of dark blue obscured by a thick crust of dried algae and rust. At first, he dismissed it as an old fishing boat or a piece of farm equipment lost long ago. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something disturbingly familiar, the distinct, curved roofline of a sedan, half buried in the silt. A cold dread, starkly out of place in the sweltering heat, prickled the back of Earl's neck. He approached the object cautiously, his heart beginning to beat a heavy, anxious rhythm against his ribs. He could now see the unmistakable silhouette of a light bar on the roof, almost completely consumed by corrosion, but still recognizable. He scraped away a patch of dried mud on the vehicle's side with a trembling, calloused hand, revealing the faint ghostly outline of the Pine Ridge Police Department shield. The breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, instantly understanding the gravity of his discovery. After 12 long years, the lake was finally giving up its most terrible secret. The phone call shattered the stagnant afternoon quiet in Detective Mark Gallo's office. He had been staring at the Sarah Jenkins file, lost in the familiar labyrinth of dead ends, when the dispatcher's unusually tense voice crackled over his desk phone. He listened, his body going rigid, the pen in his hand clattering onto a stack of cold case reports. A wave of disbelief, followed by a violent, unfamiliar surge of adrenaline, and something he hadn't felt in years. A terrifying, fragile hope crashed over him. 12 years of waiting, of imagining every possible scenario, had culminated in this single, unbelievable moment. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, The ghost he had lived with for so long suddenly feeling terrifyingly real and present. Chloe was in the hushed, orderly world of the library archives when her phone vibrated, a jarring intrusion into the silence. It was Mark. She answered, a sense of foreboding tightening her chest, as it always did when he called outside of their annual, awkward ritual. She heard the tremor in his voice before she fully processed his words. "Chloe, they found something in the lake, an old patrol car." The quiet room around her seemed to recede, the scent of old paper and binding glue fading away as a roaring filled her ears. The carefully constructed piece she had built for herself, the fragile truce with the unknown, shattered into a million pieces. The past was no longer a memory, it was a physical object, dredged up into the light. The scene at the newly exposed shoreline was a chaotic tableau of grim officialdom and morbid curiosity. Police cruisers, news vans, and the cars of local residents lined the road, their occupants forming a silent, watchful perimeter under the blazing sun. Mark pushed his way through the crowd, his gaze locked on the recovery operation, already underway. A massive tow truck with a heavy-duty winch was being positioned on the stable ground, its thick steel cables snaking down toward the object in the mud. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a mixture of dread and a long-suppressed need for answers. Every person there knew this was more than just a car. It was a time capsule, a tomb. There, half swallowed by the lake bed, was Patrol Car 7. It was a horrifying relic, a ghost from another era. Its blue and white paint was blistered and peeling, great patches eaten away by rust that bloomed like a dark metallic fungus. A thick shroud of dried mud and algae clung to its surfaces, and one of the side windows was shattered, a gaping black hole leading into its submerged interior. The Pine Ridge Police Department shield on the driver's side door was a faint, ghostly whisper of its former self. It was an image of profound violence and decay, a symbol of a promise of safety that had been broken and left to rot in the silent, crushing darkness for over a decade. The groan of the winch engine cut through the tense silence as the massive cables tightened. The recovery was a slow, agonizingly delicate process. The vehicle resisted, held fast by 12 years of accumulated silt and the sheer weight of its own waterlogged frame. With a great sucking squelch, the mud finally relinquished its grip, and the patrol car began its slow, dripping ascent into the harsh afternoon light. Mark stood frozen, his breath held tight in his chest. Beside him, having arrived just moments before, Chloe watched with a silent, devastating intensity, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. They were two solitary islands of grief, braced for the impact of a tidal wave that had been building for years. Finally, the car was on the bank, a dripping, mud-caked monolith, leaking dark, brackish water onto the dry earth. The smell that emanated from it was overwhelming, a putrid combination of stagnant water, decaying metal, and something else, something deeply unsettling and organic. A forensics officer, clad in protective gear, carefully approached the driver's side door. With a pry bar he worked at the rusted frame. The sound of the seal breaking was a sickening wet tear, and the door swung open with a final, mournful groan. For a long moment everyone fell silent, staring into the dark, silt-filled interior, a space that had been sealed off from the world since that stormy night in 1999. The initial view inside confirmed their deepest fears. The interior was a ruin of mud and preserved decay, and there, in the driver's seat, were the skeletal remains of Officer Sarah Jenkins, entangled with the tattered remnants of her uniform. The sight was a physical blow, the last, flickering ember of hope that she might have somehow survived, that she might one day walk back into their lives, was extinguished in that horrifying, definitive instant. A wave of profound, gut-wrenching grief washed over Mark, the full weight of his failure settling in his bones. Beside him, Chloe let out a small, choked sound, a single tear cutting a clean path through the dust on her cheek as she finally looked upon the reality of her mother's fate. But amidst the raw, paralyzing sorrow, the forensics team leader called out, his voice sharp and urgent. Tucked inside the heavy-duty waterproof evidence locker built into the passenger side floor, a feature Sarah had insisted on, was a single object, miraculously preserved. It was a standard-issue evidence bag, sealed and intact. Inside, shielded from the water and silt that had consumed everything else, was her personal logbook, a small leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. The discovery sent a jolt through the assembled officers. This wasn't just a recovery anymore. It was an active crime scene, and Sarah Jenkins, even in death, had just given them their first real piece of evidence. Mark took the sealed bag from the forensics tech, his hands surprisingly steady. The plastic was cool to the touch, the weight of the book inside feeling immense, a physical manifestation of 12 years of unanswered questions. Through the clear plastic, he could see the last page she had written on. The ink, a deep blue, was slightly blurred, but still legible. The final entry was not about a suspicious vehicle. It was a series of cryptic notes, a license plate number, and a name that belonged to one of Pine Ridge's most respected and powerful figures. The shock of it was like a lightning strike. The discovery of the car wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a hunt. The lake had given up its dead, but it had also revealed a monster who was still very much alive. The name in the logbook was a thunderclap in the oppressive silence of the investigation, Judge Caldwell. A man whose name was etched into the very foundations of Pine Ridge, a pillar of the community whose reputation for integrity was absolute. In the sterile quiet of the forensics lab, Mark Gallo stared at the scanned image of his partner's final, desperate scrawl. This wasn't just a lead, it was a declaration of war against an institution. Pursuing this would mean questioning the very fabric of the town he'd sworn to protect. The pressure felt immense, a physical weight on his shoulders. He was no longer just solving a cold case. He was standing at the edge of a precipice, with Sarah's ghost urging him to jump. Chloe received the news from Mark in a hushed, late-night phone call. The name Caldwell meant little to her beyond a vague recognition of local prominence, but the implications were terrifyingly clear. Her mother hadn't been the victim of a random act of violence. She had been silenced. This revelation transformed Chloe's grief from a passive, aching sorrow into a sharp-focused instrument of purpose. She would not stand by while Mark faced this alone. The next morning she met him at the station, her eyes clear and resolute. "My mother was an investigator," she stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I can't bring her back, but I can help you finish her work. Tell me everything. Show me where to start." The official forensic analysis of the logbook confirmed Mark's worst fears. The ink was consistent with the pen Sarah always carried, and the pressure of the script indicated it was written in a hurry. The entry was cryptic. Caldwell shipment, mill turnout, LPW 7B4L9K. The license plate traced back to a logistics company that had dissolved in early 2000, its records a dead end of shell corporations and phantom addresses. It was a professionally constructed maze designed to lead nowhere. The logbook was a map, but it was written in a language they didn't yet understand. It was Sarah's final message, a breadcrumb trail left in the dark, and Mark knew he was the only one left who could follow it. Mark's first step was a retreat into the past. He couldn't confront a powerful judge with a 12-year-old notebook entry. He needed to rebuild the foundation of the case from scratch, viewing every original document through the new, damning lens of Caldwell's name. He sequestered himself with the dusty boxes of the 1999 file, the brittle paper and faded ink a testament to a dozen years of failure. He ignored the fresh leads piling up on his desk, his focus narrowed to a singular point in time. He scrutinized the initial witness statements, patrol logs, and, most importantly, the procedural decisions made in those first critical 48 hours by the man then in charge, Police Chief Howard Davis. He found the retired chief tending his prize-winning roses in a manicured suburban garden, a world away from the gritty reality of police work. Howard Davis, now silver-haired and softened by retirement, listened to Mark's questions with a placid, unreadable expression. When Mark mentioned the logbook and Caldwell's name, Davis's demeanor shifted. A flicker of something, fear or perhaps annoyance, crossed his face. Sarah was a good cop, Mark, but she had a tendency to see conspiracies where there were none, he said dismissively, snipping a dead rose from its stem, chasing after a man like Judge Caldwell based on a scribble in a notebook. That's a fool's errand. Let the dead rest. The warning was unmistakable. Chloe, meanwhile, began her own quiet, methodical hunt. Using her archivist credentials, she gained access to the county's physical records vault, a cavern of forgotten documents and dusty ledgers. She wasn't looking for a smoking gun, she was looking for a thread. She spent days poring over zoning permits, property deeds, and business licenses from 1999, searching for any connection between Judge Caldwell and the derelict lumber mill. It was painstaking, tedious work, but with each file she opened, she felt a profound connection to her mother. She imagined Sarah doing the same thing, following the same paper trail, getting closer and closer to a truth that had ultimately consumed her. The ripples of Mark's renewed investigation were beginning to spread. The current police chief, a pragmatic man named Peterson, called Mark into his office. He was supportive, but visibly nervous. "I'll back you, Mark, but you need to understand what you're doing," he warned, his voice low. "Judge Caldwell has been a fixture in this county for 30 years. He has friends in the state capitol. If you take a shot at him and miss, the blowback won't just end your career, it could cripple this entire department for a decade." The conversation was another obstacle, a wall of institutional fear and political self-preservation that Mark would have to break through alone, just as Sarah must have tried to. A minor breakthrough came late one night as Mark re-examined the original dispatch recordings from 1999, comparing them to the transcribed logs. He found a discrepancy. The official typed log, signed off by Chief Davis, noted Sarah's final transmission as unintelligible static, but on the raw audio tape, Mark could hear it clearly. Mary, the dispatcher, asks, "Did she say wait?" Another officer replies, "Couldn't make it out." That single word, wait, had been officially erased from the record. It was a small detail, but it was proof of an intentional omission, the first tangible evidence that the initial investigation hadn't just been incompetent, it had been compromised from the very beginning. Chloe found the thread. Buried in a box of tax documents was a record of a land sale. The old lumber mill, which had been abandoned for years, was purchased just 6 weeks before her mother vanished. The buyer was a holding company named Northern Timber Logistics, the same phantom corporation that owned the truck from Sarah's logbook. A year after the disappearance, the property was sold to the state for a new highway project at a fraction of its purchase price. The entire transaction, from the initial zoning variance to the final sale, was personally expedited and signed by the presiding county official, Judge Thomas Caldwell. The connection was no longer a theory, it was a documented fact. The first real threat was subtle, but terrifyingly intimate. After a grueling 14-hour day, Mark walked out to his car in the near-empty station parking lot. The driver's side front tire was flat, slashed cleanly with a knife. Tucked beneath the windshield wiper was a single glossy black feather from a crow. There was no note, no grand gesture, just a quiet, menacing symbol. It was a message that he was being watched, that the ghost he was chasing had friends in the land of the living. A cold dread settled in his stomach. This wasn't just about the past anymore. The danger was present, and it was personal, a silent promise of violence yet to come. He met Chloe at a secluded booth in an all-night diner, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and shared anxiety. He told her about the tire and the feather. She showed him the photocopied property deeds linking Caldwell to the Shell Corporation. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted permanently. They were no longer just a detective and a victim's daughter. They were partners bound by a shared purpose that transcended grief. Looking at Chloe's determined face, illuminated by the low diner light, Mark saw an echo of Sarah's own formidable spirit. The realization was both comforting and deeply sobering. He was now responsible for protecting the daughter as he had failed to protect the mother. Together, they began to piece together the narrative of that final night. The suspicious vehicle call was a fabrication, a lure to draw Sarah to a specific isolated location. The lumber mill was the hub for the shipment, she had noted. It wasn't a random crime. It was a planned execution. Sarah hadn't stumbled upon a crime in progress by accident. She had been investigating Caldwell's operation quietly, off the books, and had gotten too close. They had realized she was a threat and decided to eliminate her, using the storm as cover and the deep, silent lake as a coffin. The cold, calculated nature of the plot was more monstrous than anything Mark had imagined. Mark felt the full weight of his dilemma pressing down on him. He had a powerful motive, a clear connection, and evidence of a cover-up, but it was all circumstantial. He was about to accuse a revered judge and a former police chief of a conspiracy to commit murder based on a 12-year-old notebook and a series of land transfers. The doubt was a corrosive acid in his gut. What if he was wrong? What if he destroyed innocent lives and his own career in pursuit of a ghost? He looked at the picture of Sarah taped to his monitor, her confident smile a silent rebuke to his fear. He owed it to her and to Chloe to see this through to the bitter end. They knew their next step. The paper trail and the logbook weren't enough. They needed a human element, a voice from the past that could corroborate their theory. Someone else must have been involved, someone lower on the ladder who was present at the mill that night. A driver, a lookout, someone who had been paid or threatened into silence for 12 long years. The investigation shifted from uncovering what happened to finding who else knew. Their search was no longer for clues, but for a person, a ghost living in fear. Finding that witness was their only path forward, a path that led directly into the heart of the conspiracy that had silenced Sarah Jenkins. The address for Frank Mercer, the truck driver from Sarah's logbook, felt like the final page of a book Mark had been forced to read for 12 years. But going to his house was too simple, too clean. Caldwell and Davis were watching. He could feel their eyes on his back with every step he took. So he devised a different plan, a dangerous gambit rooted in the past. He drove his unmarked car out to the derelict lumber mill as a new storm began to brew, the wind whispering through the pines like a chorus of ghosts. He was using himself as bait, creating a deliberate echo of that fateful night, hoping to draw the real monsters out of the shadows and into the rain. He didn't have to wait long. Headlights cut through the deepening twilight, and a sedan crunched to a halt on the gravel beside him. The man who emerged was not the powerful Judge Caldwell, but the stooped, silver-haired figure of retired Chief Howard Davis. He moved with a weary resignation, his face a mask of grim finality in the intermittent flashes of lightning. "You should have let it go, Mark," Davis said, his voice raspy, barely audible over the rising wind. "Some things are better left buried. Sarah was a good cop, but she was digging into something that held this whole town together. I did what I had to do to protect it, to protect all of us from the fallout." Mark stood his ground, the cold rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "Protect the town? Or protect him?" he shot back, his voice cutting through the storm. Davis's shoulders slumped in a silent, weary confession. "Caldwell called me that night," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. He was panicked. Said Jenkins had his driver cornered, that she knew about the shipments. He said he handled it. pushed her car into the lake. My job was to clean it up. He detailed the cover-up with a chilling detachment, doctoring the dispatch logs, misdirecting the initial search teams away from the deep quarry section of the lake, and burying any conflicting reports under a mountain of procedural paperwork. Suddenly, a second figure stepped out of the skeletal remains of the mill, a hunting rifle held loosely at his side. Judge Caldwell. He looked from Davis to Mark with an unnerving, almost paternal disappointment. "You always were a loyal man, Howard," the judge said, his voice smooth and commanding despite the situation, "but your sentimentality has become a liability." He raised the rifle slightly, the implication clear. He was there to tie up all the loose ends. At that exact moment, a powerful spotlight ignited from the dense tree line, pinning both Caldwell and Davis in its stark, unforgiving beam. From the darkness behind the light, Chloe's voice, amplified by a small megaphone, was sharp and clear. "It's over. We have everything." A breathtakingly tense standoff commenced. Caldwell, his face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief, swung the rifle toward the source of the light, his knuckles white on the stock. He was a cornered animal, his entire legacy of power and respect about to be obliterated by the daughter of the woman he had murdered. "You think you can touch me?" he snarled, a man unaccustomed to being defied. Mark held up his empty hands, stepping slowly between the judge and the direction of Chloe's voice. "It's done, Tom," Mark said, his voice low and steady, trying to anchor the man's spiraling desperation. "She recorded everything, every word Davis just said. There's no way out." The standoff didn't break with the crack of Caldwell's rifle, but with the sudden piercing wail of approaching sirens. The sound grew from a distant cry to an overwhelming roar as a half-dozen patrol cars, lights flashing, swarmed the turnout, their headlights cutting through the rain-lashed darkness from every direction. The authority in Caldwell's posture evaporated, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of a man whose power had just been rendered meaningless. He dropped the rifle with a hollow clatter on the wet gravel. Davis simply closed his eyes, a man surrendering not to the police, but to the crushing weight of a 12-year-old sin. Justice had finally arrived, methodical and absolute, in a storm just like the one that had hidden the crime. As uniformed officers took a stunned Caldwell and a defeated Davis into custody, Mark walked toward the tree line where Chloe emerged, her face streaked with rain and tears, the camera still clutched in her trembling hands. They stood together in the downpour, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting silently on the surface of the dark lake. There was no elation, no sense of victory, only a profound, hollowed-out relief. The ghost that had stood between them for so long was finally at rest. The questions that had defined their lives had been answered. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was not empty but clean, a quiet space where healing could finally, after 12 long years, begin. The trials of Judge Caldwell and former Chief Davis sent a seismic shock through Pine Ridge, shattering the town's carefully constructed self-image. The proceedings laid bare a rot that had festered for over a decade, forcing the community to confront the uncomfortable truth that the monsters weren't outsiders, but men they had admired and trusted. The conviction of both men brought a grim legal finality, but it couldn't erase the deep sense of betrayal. The name Sarah Jenkins was no longer a ghost story whispered at the lake's edge. It became a symbol of integrity and sacrifice. The town's placid surface had been permanently disturbed, revealing the dark currents beneath, and in its place grew a more somber, more honest understanding of itself. For Detective Mark Gallo, the silence in his office was a new and unfamiliar language. The Sarah Jenkins file, his constant companion for 12 years, was finally gone, archived in the cold case vault under Solved. Wampo. The crushing weight of guilt that had hunched his shoulders for so long had finally lifted, yet it left behind not elation, but a profound and hollowed-out peace. He had fulfilled his solemn vow, but the obsession that had defined his life and consumed his personal relationships was over. Staring out the window at the rain, he could finally see Sarah's face in his mind, not as a failure to be avenged, but as a partner to be remembered with pride and sorrow. Chloe stood before the new headstone in the Pine Ridge Cemetery, the granite cool and solid beneath her fingertips. For the first time, there was a date of death etched below her mother's name, a definitive period at the end of a sentence that had haunted her entire life. The gnawing uncertainty that had been the foundation of her existence had been replaced by the solid ground of truth. The anger had subsided, leaving a clean, pure grief she could finally embrace and process. She was no longer defined by her mother's absence, but by her legacy. She was the daughter of a hero who had fought for the truth, and in that knowledge, Chloe found the strength to finally begin building a future of her own. Months later, on a bright, clear autumn day, Mark and Chloe walked along the shore of the lake. The water, now returned to its normal level, sparkled under the sun, its surface no longer a menacing secret keeper, but simply a beautiful, natural expanse. They didn't speak much, their shared journey having forged a bond that transcended words. The awkwardness that had once defined their meetings had been replaced by a comfortable, quiet companionship. They were two survivors who had navigated the darkest of storms together and had emerged into the calm on the other side. The lake had once been a symbol of their shared trauma. Now it was a place where they could acknowledge their shared healing, a testament to their resilience. The experience had irrevocably altered the course of Chloe's life. Inspired by her mother's relentless pursuit of the truth and her own role in uncovering it, she enrolled in law school. The quiet archivist had discovered a fierce advocate within herself, a voice for those who had been silenced. Her personal tragedy was transformed into a universal purpose, to ensure that no other family would have to endure the agonizing limbo of not knowing. It was her way of honoring Sarah, not by dwelling on the past, but by carrying her mother's unyielding commitment to justice into the future, turning a legacy of loss into a powerful force for good in the world. On the 13th anniversary of her disappearance, Mark and Chloe stood together again at Sarah's grave. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves a brilliant tapestry of red and gold. Mark placed a single white rose on the headstone, a silent gesture of respect and farewell. Chloe laid her hand on the cold stone, a quiet thank you passing between the living and the dead. There were no more questions, no more ghosts. There was only the quiet dignity of a life remembered and a duty fulfilled. The long, dark night that began with a storm in 1999 was finally over, and in the peaceful silence of the cemetery, the first light of a new morning had finally broken.